In this series of videos, we're going to be discussing what is known as public choice economics, or sometimes just simply public choice. And now this is one of my favorite topics in all of economics to go through. I think it has both microeconomic and macroeconomic implications. We're going to talk about it more in the microeconomics context. So let's get started first by just introducing what public choice actually is. Public choice analysis is a branch of economics that applies the principles and methodology of economics to the operation of the political process. And over the past 60 years, research in this area has greatly enhanced our understanding of how the political process works and the structure of outcomes and the effect on economics that it generates. But more simply put, we can just think of public choice as the study of political behavior or any sort of decision that we make as a public group using the tools of economics. It is the tools of economics applied to politics. Now, microeconomics, it tends to understand human action at the individual level. We're looking at the individual tree as opposed to the forest. But microeconomic policy is done at these high political levels, and it usually involves some sort of group action or group decision making. But we have to remember that we're still applying the same assumptions of economic analysis to political agents and their constituents. So what public choice does, it kind of rejects this assumption that public policy, by definition, will just correct any sort of market failure or market problem. If the free market gets a result that is not perfect or suboptimal, somehow government action can fix it. Somehow public policy can reach that result. But what public choice does is says, hold on, if we're applying the same tools of economics to political decisions, we have to recognize that markets are certainly imperfect, but governments are imperfect as well. And so what happens if we tend to make this mistake? What happens if we just think that, oh, well, government action will lead to some sort of perfect result? So let's maybe discuss a quick little example of that. So suppose that there's an emperor, and this emperor, he decides to hold a contest. The emperor realizes that he's feeling kind of bored lately and he wants to be entertained. So he decides to have the emperor's singing contest, and anyone in the kingdom, okay, they can participate in this contest. And whoever wins, right, they're going to get a bunch of money, they're going to get a bunch of fame and fortune, they'll be able to perform permanently in the emperor's palace for time to come, forever and ever and ever. Okay? However, the first contestants enter and they're terrible. Okay, so the first singing contestants, they come and they just do an awful job. It's one of the worst performances that the emperor has ever heard, and we're so upset. Everyone in the land's so upset. It was such a letdown. Okay? However, that was just the first contestant. Okay? The problem is the next contestant comes in, and he's just as bad. I mean, it's terrible. In fact, he might even be worse than the previous contestant. So what went wrong? What was the mistake that the emperor made here? So the example of the emperor singing contest, it's a metaphor for what we call in public choice economics the nirvana fallacy. So the nirvana fallacy, this is when you attack an obtainable but imperfect option by comparing it to an unobtainable but perfect alternative. So in that example, the idea was there's going to be this perfect singer, but the problem is nobody's a perfect singer, and there might not necessarily always be an amazing but perfect singer. Okay, maybe the Jonas Brothers and Justin Bieber were fine, but the emperor still might have been disappointed because they weren't perfect. But the problem is that's unobtainable, right? This utopian idea of a perfect singer. Well, we do this in markets all the time. Okay, as we know, there's no solutions. There's only trade-offs. No matter what, we have to give something up. And we sometimes see an economic result and see that there's still problems, and that's certainly true. And sometimes the market doesn't do the best job. Sometimes there's still shortages, there's surpluses, and as we know with equilibrium, they tend to go away with time. But time itself is costly. And so we might attack some sort of obtainable outcome, although it's imperfect, and we compare it to something that we can't possibly get. We just kind of say that if decentralized markets don't always lead to efficient levels of production, then somehow the government can. But this is a mistake because we're trying to compare this imperfect option that we can see in the real world to an unobtainable utopian idea that's not possible for us to achieve. Okay? So the problem with this nirvana fallacy and what public choice economists discuss is this way of thinking assumes that the government can somehow achieve the efficient level of production when markets can't. Okay? This is associated with what's known as the knowledge problem. Okay, there's just no way that one individual decision maker, even at a very high intelligent level of government, or some collection of political decision makers, can grasp all of the knowledge necessary to centrally plan and coordinate all the individual actions and decisions in a market economy. And then this also assumes that the government can somehow aim to achieve that efficient level. So what do I mean by that? Well, this is associated with the incentive problem. It might be that politicians and political decision makers don't always have the incentive to get us to that efficient level. Okay, well, that doesn't make sense. I mean, don't you go into politics because you want to help people? And, when we say efficient, okay, we mean the efficient level socially for all of society. Can we get the efficient market outcome? Okay, but it turns out there might be an incentive to deviate from that if you're a politician, and that's because there might be private incentives for those politicians and political decision makers, okay, to deviate and find efficient things for them as opposed to all of society. So what this nirvana fallacy and public choice is showing us is that political action, it may go wrong without intent. That's the knowledge problem. Okay? But political action might also go wrong with intent. And that's the incentive problem. So if we think about the first point, this idea that we might have actions go wrong without intent, this is usually because government or political decision makers fail to consider any secondary effects or unintended consequences of their actions. And economics gives us the tools to look ahead. So what might happen if we make a mistake, if we fail to take into account the secondary effects or potential unintended consequences of a political decision? So one example of this was the Americans with Disabilities Act in the 90s. And this act was intended to help those with disabilities in the workplace to avoid discrimination. Just because you're a disabled worker, the idea was, hey, like you shouldn't be discriminated against because of that, and we should make it so that these workers or these employers, they can help you and provide you with handicap needs, right? They need to adjust it so they can add wheelchair ramps into their workplace and make bathrooms a little more handicap accessible, and also we can't just get rid of you simply because you're handicapped. And that sounds great. I mean, why shouldn't people with disabilities be able to work in a job like anybody else? The problem with this was that two economists, Acemoglu and Angress, they found that when the Americans with Disabilities Act was enacted in 1992, it ended up leading to a sharp drop in the employment of disabled workers. Well, how could that be? I mean, the idea was this act made it so you couldn't terminate these people simply because they were disabled. Well, employers were concerned that they wouldn't be able to discipline or fire disabled workers if they happen to be incompetent. Right? So just because they're disabled doesn't mean, well, they can't be a bad worker, just like you or me. If we do a bad job, we should probably lose our job. And so employers became so concerned, and they were concerned they also wouldn't be able to keep up with the costs of making more wheelchair accessible ramps and other things. They decided to just avoid hiring disabled workers completely. And so this actually harmed the employment of disabled workers, even though this very act was made with the intent of helping them stay employed. Another example of this is what's known as the Omnibus Budget Reconciliation Act. And so this was also implemented in the 1990s. And so what happened here was a tax was imposed, a luxury tax, on certain goods, and yachts is one of the most common example. And the idea was, hey, the government could raise tax revenue by taxing the wealthy without hurting average households. And this sounded great. If we could just not hurt average households and average individuals, but we can just take a little more money from the wealthy via these luxury taxes, right? If they go buy a yacht or some other expensive thing, we'll be able to raise revenue. And the projection was that this tax was going to raise around $31 million. I mean, $31 million in tax revenue, that's not nothing. The problem was, okay, even though consumers of yachts tended to be very wealthy, demand for yachts was still very price elastic. Okay, I mean, the demand for yachts was still very sensitive to price changes. And so when the prices rose due to the tax, wealthy buyers, they just stopped buying new yachts, or they bought them abroad, or went elsewhere with their consumer dollars. And so this tax didn't actually get anywhere near that 31 million that they expected or projected it to get. It ended up only getting around 16 million. But that's not all. there was a net loss of 7,000 jobs in the yacht industry alone. And many of these jobs were not held by the super rich people that bought the yachts. They were held by working class individuals that helped to make the yachts, the craftsmen, the builders, okay, the suppliers. So as a result, the federal government ended up having to pay out a bunch of unemployment benefits to these workers that lost their jobs. And these benefits were estimated to completely offset or even go past the revenue that they did end up making, which was already well below projected levels. I believe Congress even needed to have an emergency session to repeal this law. It was so disastrous. So these were just some examples of political decisions kind of going bad, but without intent, simply because, well, of the knowledge problem. We don't necessarily take into account these secondary effects. And what's so great about the price system is that we can kind of see that. We don't necessarily need to know why a price goes up or down. We don't need to know every single piece of information, but we'll still adjust our behavior accordingly. And so that's the first point. Okay, but on to the second point, this idea that the government might not necessarily have the incentive, okay, to implement the efficient outcome. So what does that mean? Does that mean that they really want to make things go bad? Well, it's not necessarily that politicians are all malicious, terrible, bad people. Okay, but the point is they have their own self-interest, just like anybody else, just like you and me. When we wake up and decide to do whatever we're going to do with our day, we have our own self-interest. We have our own end goals in mind, and so do politicians. They're just like you and me. They're people. So just as economists use self-interest in the structure of incentives to analyze markets, public choice economists use them to analyze political choices and the operation of government. After all, the same exact people make decisions in both sectors. If self-interest and the structure of incentives influence market choices, there's a good reason to expect that they'll also influence choices in a political setting. So public choice is sometimes referred to as politics without romance. And all this means is we should look at politics without this romantic notion of all politicians somehow being all in for the public interest, they're only civil servants, and they're omniscient and benevolent actors. We'd assume that since markets were not perfect and could fail, the alternative must be better. But part of the reason why is that we assume that this sneaky, greedy behavior in the private sector and that there would be benevolent and omniscient behavior in the political arena. But like I said, political agents, they're rational and self-interested economizers, just like you and me. They respond to incentives and they need certain information to act consistently with those incentives. So what happens when we apply economics to politics? What happens when we allow the limitations and motivations of politicians to be more human? Well, public choice gives us three key insights when we make politics a little more human. And we're going to discuss these in the next series of videos. The first is this idea that politicians, they favor special interests. Number two is that government bureaucracy, it's inefficiently large and has some weird incentives. And three, voters are ignorant and turnout in elections tends to be relatively low. So that's just the introduction to public choice. Next up, we're going to discuss politicians and special interests.